Hi, my name is Phil, and my wife Amy and I are building a Chesapeake Light Craft Teardrop Camper. If you saw the earlier video where we cut out the back of the camper, this is the part where we get the camper ready to put the hatch back on. This is the video of the Galley gutter. Yes, I know this video isn't in the same order as the build manual, and yes, I installed the Galley gutter before the transom, as is completely obvious in the videos. You don't need to do these things in a particular order, but looking back, I guess it probably was a little easier to do the Galley gutter before the transom or the rooftop hatch bezel, but only because I used those openings as I clamped the gutter in place. Mea culpa, mi estas idioto. If you find you can't clamp the way you'd like, you can always find a creative way to use Gorilla Tape. If you're following the build manual closely, you'll also notice that I didn't do a fillet on the outside of the gutter riser. That was a conscious choice on my part. I liked the crisp corner, and I wasn't sure a fillet wouldn't get in the way of the hatch closing properly. Before we get to that, you might be wondering why I stick blue tape on my sanding block. It's because that block is black rubber and it leaves a mark if you rub the side on a part of the camper as you're trying to sand into a corner. You should have some clamps. I have hundreds of various types, shapes, and sizes, but the most useful here are the quick clamps that tighten one-handed and spring clamps. I happen to have several sizes of the quick clamps, and I would suggest using the lighter ones, not the really beefy ones, since you don't need a huge amount of clamping force, and the heavier the clamp, the more it tends to make things flex and bend. I also have some 6-inch, 4-inch, and 2-inch spring clamps. I don't think you'll find the 2-inch spring clamps very helpful here. They would clamp something about half an inch thick by about half an inch deep, or less. You'll see the quick clamps and both the 4 and 6-inch clamps used in installing the Galley gutter. Another thing I did to prepare for working on the Galley was to tape some plastic sheeting onto the Galley flat to avoid leaving blobs of thickened epoxy somewhere. You will need to measure the depth you mount the Galley gutter, and I used a little depth gauge that someone was giving away for free at a trade show. You can find these at the counter of some hardware stores, and they're also available on Amazon for a little over $3. If you're using a chisel or a plane, cutting through fiberglass and resin is hard on the edge. Be prepared to sharpen your tools after every use. The little blade in my dollhouse plane looked more like a saw blade after a while. It's a cheap little tool, but it has to be sharp to do its job. You can't just stick a gutter on the Galley. You have to do some fillets first, and some fiberglass and epoxy. But you've seen that before, so I won't bother you with it. Oh, all right. If you're lucky, I might even throw in some sanding. After you cut out the Galley hatch, you now have access to the Galley, and since you are likely to have a heavy battery and some other good stuff back there, you will need to reinforce the connection between the Galley flat and the rest of the camper. You do that with
thickened epoxy fillets.
After sanding the rough edge, I put some blue tape, leaving enough room for a fillet and covering up the slot near the top of the bulkhead. You don't want to have to chisel thickened epoxy out of that later. You will want to do fillets around the bulkhead and the sides of the Galley flat before you install the gutter risers or the Galley gutter. I removed the blue tape after cleaning up the fillets, so I didn't have blue tape permanently embedded in the thickened epoxy somewhere. The gutter risers raise the lower part of the Galley gutter up off the Galley flat, and they sit in a slot in the Galley flat. After a dry fit and a bit of sanding to make everything fit well, I squeezed some thickened epoxy into the slot and installed the risers. The risers can be held in place if you feel them shift by leaving some weighty objects on them. If you've already installed the transom, you can also try using some long clamps that reach the bottom of the camper. This is another spot where CLC reminds you to clean up the epoxy well. It's tough to sand into tight angles like these, so cleaning out the corners while the epoxy is soft will make an easier job later. After the fillets were hard, I taped some plastic to protect the galley flat. Around the same time as you are doing the fillets, you can cut out thin strips of fiberglass and glass the sections of the galley gutter. It comes in 3 pieces, 1 upper piece, and 2 lower parts that you join together. Amy fiberglassed the gutter, and I trimmed and sanded it. Unfortunately, I left it overnight and the epoxy was rock hard, which made trimming the excess a pain in the butt. That's why I keep repeating, trim the excess fiberglass while the epoxy is still a bit soft and flexible. The slot near the top of the bulkhead receives the upper edge of the gutter. Don't be surprised if it doesn't feel like the gutter fits into the slot. I did a little sanding and tweaking and then clamped the gutter into the slot as well as I could. I also had to sand the sides to get them to fit as well. The fillet you will put in should hold the riser and the gutter securely, so not to worry. Once you have the upper part in place, you install the lower, but first you need to fit it to the sides of the camper and also trim it where it overlaps the upper half. I marked the lower half of the gutter and cut it to fit. I also found I needed to sand and trim the gutter so it didn't spring into a bow. You want a close fit, but one that doesn't spring the gutter out of shape. Although, if you make the fit too loose, the fillets you add later will fill in and hide the gap. CLC calls for the gutter to be installed 5/8 of an inch below the edge of the sides. I used my cheapo depth gauge to set this depth. I started stitching the bottom part of the gutter to the risers to hold it in place and started tacking it with CA glue. I used the stitches to prevent the gutter from sliding off the risers. Once I was satisfied with the fit, I marked and trimmed the lower piece of the gutter to mate up with the upper part. If you're really concerned with getting the gutter in exactly the right place, you could try putting in a few stitches on the side of the camper. That would be overkill, I think, but if you're fighting with the gutter, that's one of your options. The upper and lower parts of the galley gutter are joined together using a small piece of fiberglass tape and unthickened epoxy. I clamped the two pieces together and used some pieces of mylar to keep the joints nice and flat, and to prevent the clamps from being embedded in the epoxy. If you haven't installed the transom yet, you can use stitches and spring clamps like I did to hold the gutter against the riser. If you already have the transom installed, then you can use stitches and maybe a heavy object or two to hold the gutter in place at the right angle. I took some scrap blocks of wood and used them to support the lower part of the gutter where it meets the risers and hold it at a precise 29-ish degrees. I adjusted the depth of the gutter with my depth gauge and then tacked it using CA glue. Then Amy and I did fillets all around the gutter, above and below it, and along the gutter riser. After gluing and filleting the gutter in place, the next step was to clean up the lower part of the gutter and sand it rounded where it met the risers. Then I did a final coat of epoxy on the gutter and the fillets. I had a little leftover epoxy, so I filled in that gap where the top of the quarter panels meets the galley flat. If you enjoyed this video, or even if you spent the last 13 minutes wondering how this ended up in your Stitch and Quilt video feed, please like and subscribe, and don't forget to click on the bell so you get notified when I upload another video. Thanks for watching.